When I was still a child, one of the television shows that made weekly appearance in my house was Gunsmoke. And there was something about the character of Marshal Matt Dillon. Strong, brave, honest, a man of character, always fighting for what was right. Now, I was particularly partial to Festus, but that's because he was just a little off-kilter, and, well, I was probably a little off-kilter myself, so. But one of the scenes, how many of you remember Gunsmoke?
It's still on.
It's still on, okay. You know, one of the scenes that would recur, one of the themes that would recur, was there would be some criminal in jail under the protection of the marshal and his deputies, and an angry mob would come marching down the street. They would have rifles and pistols, they would have torches, and they were filled with a sense of revenge and vengeance. And they were going to take this man out of the jail and give him what was due. They were going to hang him from a high tree. And there would be Matt Dillon calming the crowd, reminding them of what was right and what was wrong, and sending them back to their homes so that justice could ultimately be sought. Mob rule. Days when a handful of people filled with anger and venom might grow into more than a handful. And how to calm them. I'm not going to talk today so much about modern news as I'm going to talk about an ancient event. We're working through the Gospel of Luke, and we're getting very close to the end. In Luke chapter 22, verses 63 through 23, verse 25, we have 5 scenes where Jesus is on trial, if you will. He's been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and now he is being held, and he is being tried, and at the end of this, he will be handed over to be crucified. And it seems through the story that everything is out of control. Well, let me assure you before I even begin that nothing is out of control. Things unfold simply in accordance with God's design for offering the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So don't lose sight of that as we walk through today, okay? I'll be reading each section singularly instead of reading the whole part as one. I'll be reading from the New American Standard Version if you'd like to follow along. In Luke chapter 22, beginning at verse 63 through 65, just a short little paragraph. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophesy, who's the one who hit you?" And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. At this point, Jesus is probably being held primarily by temple guards, by men who are a part of the Jewish nation, who are serving in the temple and under the oversight of the council, the Sanhedrin, who we'll get to in just a little bit. These are men who had probably been in synagogue all their days. Men who probably had heard and read portions of the law, if not all of it. They knew the messianic hope of their people. And yet they look at Jesus, who's just been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and while they're holding him, while they're awaiting the trials even to begin, he's mocked and he's beaten. You're a prophet? You're the Christ? You're the Son of God? Let's play a little game. Wear this blindfold, and when we strike you, you tell us which one of us it was. It's probably a good thing that I'm not the Son of God. Because in that sense, I probably would have called out the name of the person who hit me, and I probably would have just zapped him out of existence. That's probably how I would have responded. But scriptures tell us, not here in Luke, but in the other Gospels, that Jesus simply remained silent. The Son of God who told us in Gethsemane that if he wanted to, he could call down a whole legion of angels from heaven to defend him, to deliver him. I'm not sure he would even have needed a whole legion of angels. I think he could have defended himself. And yet as they mock him, as they beat him, as they blaspheme him, he remains silent. Because he is on the course to the cross, on the path to the cross that has been laid out before him. Simple way that I look at this is that the guards were filled with cruelty and hatred, with animosity and a real meanness that grew out of their very hearts. Cruelty. You know, today there are still those who are cruel in sense and in regard to Jesus Christ. Follow along some conversation in social media, following an article that deals with a current event like a tragedy in Las Vegas or a hurricane in Puerto Rico, and see how people are angry and vindictive and cruel towards God. And how that flows over and begins to be pointed towards the people of God who might try to defend him. The world that does not know God, though deep in their souls long for him, in that conflict and in that confusion, are often very cruel. Often very cruel. It often shows itself forth in persecution against the people of God. You can read stories through the writings of the Voice of the Martyrs or International Christian Concern or Christian Freedom International or other ministries that care for the persecuted Christians that are around the world. And story after story of how people, simply because of their love for Jesus, are hated by the world. Yet why are we surprised? Because didn't Jesus himself say, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first? We're simply following in his steps. The stories don't end here, though. After Jesus has been mocked and beat and blasphemed against, we pick up in verse 66. When it was day, the sun has finally risen. When it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "Yes, I am." And then they said, "What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." The council here is what we call the Sanhedrin, the ruling elders of the people of Israel. Their power is limited because, remember, Israel is an occupied nation. The Roman Empire is the political power. But the Sanhedrin held great sway, and they often influenced Rome as to who would be the governor over them, currently Pilate, who we'll get to in just a moment. And they gather to hold a trial. They're going to speak to who Jesus is. They want one question answered. Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? The very words that we affirm when we speak the good confession. I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. A very truth that is foundational to who we are as disciples of Jesus Christ. And here are the leaders of Israel wanting to know, is this who you are? But hear what Jesus says. Jesus says, if I tell you, you won't believe me. In essence, he's saying, you have no real desire for truth. You have your minds made up already as to who I am. And if I query you, if I ask you questions that might cause you to think a little bit deeper and wrestle a little bit with the truth, you won't even answer me. So I'll put it bluntly. You'll soon see me at the right hand of the Father. So you are the Son of God? Yes. Yes, I am. And they reject the truth. They want nothing to do with the truth. While Luke does not record the broader aspect of this trial, as you go through Matthew and Mark and John, you know that witnesses, mostly false witnesses, were brought before the Sanhedrin to speak of what Jesus had said and what Jesus had done. And nothing would stick. Nothing would hold water as an accusation against him. But when he himself says, yes, I am the Son of God, they say, what more do we need? We don't need to hear from any other witnesses. He's spoken those words himself. And since his words are what? Obviously false. This is not who he is. He can't be the Christ. He can't be the Son of God. They condemn him. They condemn him. I simply put this down as these spiritual leaders, these who should have known the truth, these who were awaiting the Messiah, were deaf to his words. They were deaf to his words. They were oblivious to the truth. It's amazing to me how many opinions there are in the world. I don't know the world's population. I don't know if we've hit 8 billion yet. We may have. But that would mean that there's 8 billion opinions in the world. And some of them come close to agreeing, but many of them stand totally opposed one to another. It amazes me even how within Christendom, people who are followers of Jesus Christ can pick up the same book, read the same words, and yet wind up with differing opinions. Disfellowshipping from others, refusing to walk as brothers and sisters of faith. I wonder if sometimes we aren't a little bit like the Sanhedrin, so sure of what we think we know that we can't hear the truth. That Jesus' words, if I told you, you will not believe, might strike a little bit closer to home than we would like. Well, one of the things about being an occupied nation is this. You can't exercise the death penalty. While your law, Jesus has blasphemed, claiming to be God, by our law he should die. Well, we need Roman authority to do so. So we pick up at the next step, chapter 23, verse 1. Then the whole body of them, the entire Sanhedrin, 70 men, okay? 70 men, got up and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." So Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "It is as you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they kept on insisting, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place." And when Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. Pilate is Rome's governor over Judah, over the Jewish state. He's in Jerusalem. And the council members bring Jesus before Pilate, and they level their accusations. They make many accusations, but the interesting thing is only one of them's true. I have to find it almost humorous that they say he's telling people not to pay their taxes. Man, I wish he had said, "Don't pay your taxes." I'd obey that in a heartbeat. That's not what he said, remember? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. And his apostle Paul would pick that theme up in the book of Romans. And so, hey, I pay my taxes. Such it is. They just flat out lied, because if you want to make a government official mad, start a tax revolt, because they want their money. But it was a lie. Misleading our nation. Now, maybe they thought that was true, but it's interesting when you read the words of Jesus in the Gospels, everything was leading people back to God. That's not misleading. That is the best message you could possibly present. Here is how to walk with the God who created you. Here is how to walk with the God who loves you. Here is how to walk with the God who redeems you. And that God is revealed in me. But they were right when they said he claims to be Christ, a king. Again, Luke doesn't give us quite as much as we get from the Gospel of John. In John chapter 18, beginning at verse 33, we have a bigger part, a broader dialogue. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" And Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." And therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth but hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." But notice what Pilate does. When he says, "I find no guilt in this man," and the council, the Sanhedrin, continues to push, they're insisting, we're told. He stirs up the people. He's creating riots and dissension and unrest in this nation that you're sent here to keep the peace over. Pilate picks up on the fact that he had been from Galilee, and Herod, who's been appointed by Rome as to be a king, just a title really, over the region of Galilee, says, send him to Herod. So this is what I put down. Pilate and other people, even in our day, have a tendency to sidestep the issue. What will I do with Jesus? I'll defer. I'll table the conversation for another day. I'm going to sidestep the issue. Don't press me on this one. I decline to make a decision. That's basically what Pilate's doing here, and what so many people in our day do as well. Who do people say that I am? Jesus asked his apostles, and many answers were given. We would probably get many answers in our day as well. But I think we would honestly get some people who would say, I don't know. And I don't care to know. You know? If he's a fantasy or a fairy tale, if he was just another religious spokesman of 2,000 years ago, then I can ignore him. If he's the Son of God, if he's the Christ who he claims to be, then the only logical response is to surrender to him, and I'm not sure I want to do that. Either way puts me in a position I'm not comfortable with, so I'll just sidestep making a decision about Jesus. And so Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. Jesus really isn't interested in spending much time with Herod. I kind of like this story. We pick up in chapter 23, verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. Herod was very curious about Jesus. He was convinced earlier that it was John the Baptist come back from the dead. You see, he had had John beheaded because he was a rather spineless king. And now that Jesus was preaching and performing miracles, Herod just assumed that that's what had happened. Notice that while we read in the Gospels that many people went out to Jesus. Many people went out to Jesus. Wherever he was, people went out. Even his opponents went out to see him and to hear him. But obviously Herod had not. Herod for some time hoped to hear Jesus, had hoped to see Jesus. He'd heard stories, heard all kinds of stories. But he had not pursued truth. And all of a sudden, here is Jesus in front of him. And Herod begins to ask question after question. And his desire was, maybe I'll get to see a miracle. I hear he can turn water into wine. I've got a party coming up tonight. Maybe he'll make me some. I've heard that he can heal the sick, the lame, the blind, the deaf. I've got a sick servant over here. Maybe he'll make him well. But the attitude of Herod was not one of seeking the honor and the glory of God and knowing who Jesus is. It was one of, I put down, curiosity. He saw Jesus as like some kind of circus sideshow freak. One of my favorite movies, because my kids have drilled it into my head over the years, is Little Rascals. And in Little Rascals, they have to raise some money because their clubhouse is burnt down, and one of the things that they do is they go to the circus. And the one character stands as a barker, trying to get people's attention. He says, "Step right up, see the 5-foot man eating chicken." And when the curtain comes back, what do you see? You see one of the kids, 5 feet tall, and he's got a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. He's a 5-foot man eating chicken. That's a great scene. I love it. That's what Herod's looking for. Herod is looking for entertainment. Come on, Jesus. Do a miracle. Do something flashy for me. And Jesus simply remains silent. Do we ever look at Jesus like some kind of talisman? Some kind of lucky charm to put in our pocket and rub him on his head when we want him to act in some way? There are all kinds of people who would look to Jesus in a moment of great personal need or curiosity, but have no thought for him in any other context. This was Herod. And Herod gets irritated. Jesus won't answer. So once again, Herod and his soldiers treat him with contempt. They mock him, and they put a kingly robe upon him. "Oh, you're the king of the Jews? Here, let's dress you up in one of my robes, since I'm king of the Jews." And he says, "Send him back to Pilate. But tell Pilate thanks." Mockery of God can make strange bedfellows. Herod and Pilate, who had hated each other before, all of a sudden become friends because of their mutual connection with the trials of Jesus. Verse 13. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people. See, the crowd has become a big one now. And he said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I'll punish him and release him." And now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. But they cried out all together, saying, "Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas." He was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify, crucify him." And he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. Therefore I will punish him and release him." But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified. And their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. But he delivered Jesus to their will. This is where I get the picture of mob rule. The picture on the screen is from the Passion of the Christ, but it simply portrays this scene. A great crowd of people led by their religious leaders who are crying out for Jesus' execution. Pilate 3 times trying to quiet the crowd, saying, "I find no cause for execution. I find no reason for his death. I'll punish him and I'll set him free." And the crowd gets louder and louder and angrier. "Crucify him." Why? What has he done? It's a harsh picture. The crowd, filled with animosity and anger. Pilate seeking repeatedly to free Jesus. Has him beaten, has him flogged in hopes of that being some kind of appeasement, that the Jewish leaders will be satisfied simply to see him beaten within an inch of his life. But they say, no, we'd rather have a murderous insurrectionist by the name of Barabbas than Jesus. Crucify this Jesus. And finally, Pilate gives up. He released Barabbas, and he delivered Jesus to their will. Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted. Now, do you remember the thing that I told you at the beginning to keep in mind? That we can read this story and think that everything is out of control. We can read this story and think, yep, this is definitely mob rule. But it all actually happens to be the work of God to purchase us, to redeem us from our sin. Jesus himself in John chapter 18 makes it very clear. In verse 10, John 10. I looked at the verse. Yeah, go ahead and bring it up there, Al. It's right on the screen. It's just wrong in my eyes because I can't see very good. John chapter 10, verse 11 says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Get that? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And then when you get down just a few more verses 17 and 18, Jesus says, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it up again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. When I read through the Gospel of Luke and these verses that we've looked at this morning, my heart almost breaks. And I think, poor Jesus. I want to be like Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane, pulling out a sword and whacking off Malchus's ear. Let me stand up for Jesus. This isn't fair. But again, just like with Peter, we hear Jesus say, put the sword away. Put it away. And we hear him say, no one takes my life. The cruel guards, they didn't take his life. The deaf religious leaders, they didn't take his life. The indecisive Pilate, he didn't take his life. The curious Herod did not take his life. And even Pilate at the end, when he finds himself unable to do what is right by setting Jesus free, he's not the one who takes Jesus' life. Matter of fact, no one took Jesus' life. No one. Jesus laid it down. And Jesus takes it up. The crucifixion and the resurrection. Primarily today, what I want you to do is go home with the thought in your mind of the depth of the grace of God. Did you notice all that Jesus went through? We're not even to the cross yet. We're just in the trials. Beaten, mocked, ridiculed. The depth of his grace, which reaches out to us because of the love of God. We'll get to the cross next week. I want you to go home thinking about what he has done for you and why he's done it. But something in the preacher in me also wants to send you home with another challenge. Okay, so I want to ask you a question. It is just this: what will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus? You can oppose him, like the guards who were cruel. Usually we see these negative responses on the outside of the church walls coming from a world that does not know him. But I've known, though in rare cases, people to be particularly destructive to the people of God because of their bad attitudes and hard hearts? Will you turn a deaf ear to him? I worry about this one because I think it's common for those of us, even though we're Christians, to pick up a passage of Scripture in our Bibles and we hear Jesus tell us, love your enemy, and we just can't. Or we won't. Or we hear him tell us to make disciples of all nations, and we just can't, or we won't. I fear that sometimes we tend to turn a deaf ear to Jesus when he speaks truth. Will we sidestep what we want to do with him? We push him aside because we know just enough of the truth about Jesus to be anxious about surrender to his lordship in our lives. And so we try to defer the decision. Do we ever use him as entertainment? Jesus, do something for me. Wow me with your divine power. Do we ever refuse to do right by him? What will you do with Jesus? But rather than those negatives that are revealed in the trials of Jesus, how about these positives? And with this I conclude. How about we identify with Jesus? We boldly wear his name. I am a Christian. I am a Christ follower. I am one of his disciples. Yesterday, Joshua and I had the opportunity to go down to Kinnick Stadium. I wore my blue and orange. And I wore my blue and orange proudly, even while we got beat 45-16. Okay? Joshua was wearing black and gold. If he hadn't driven, I'd have made him walk home. You know, I wore my blue and orange. Why? Because I identify with the Fighting Illini. Even in the midst of Kinnick Stadium, with all those weird Iowans. Why do we find it so hard to identify with Jesus in this world? Why? Identify with him. Wear the name of Christ. And if I may, wear it boldly. Even as the apostles in the book of Acts prayed, give us boldness that we might speak your word. Stand with Jesus. Where he speaks, we must speak. We can't turn a deaf ear to him. But when he speaks, this is where we'll stand. Where it has to do with his identity as Christ, the Son of God, this is where I stand. There's no other answer that I can give. Whether it has to do with the life of discipleship revealed in the Sermon on the Mount, this is where I stand. This is what he's called me to be. This is who I have to be. I stand with Jesus. Surrender to. This is the idea of obedience. Paul tells Timothy, watch your life and doctrine closely. I refer to that text often, especially in my own life, because how we live flows from what we believe. Watch your life and doctrine closely. If your doctrine is askance, then your life won't be what it's supposed to be. What we do flows from what we believe. Surrender to Jesus. It's obedience. See, we can say the right words and yet still not be very obedient. I want to say the right words because I believe these things to be true, and I want to live them by the power of the Spirit with the light of the gospel directing my path. And so finally, I put down, follow him all the days of your life. There was an old hymn that simply said, where he leads me, I will follow. Where he leads me, I will follow. Man, I want to follow Jesus wherever. And the neat thing about that is, he leads. I follow. He doesn't say, Bill, go, and I'll sit back here and watch you. He says, Bill, follow, and I will go with you. What will you do with Jesus? There were an awful lot of folks there in those verses in Luke as Jesus had been arrested and before his crucifixion that made all the wrong choices. Let's not make the wrong choices ourselves. Okay? I'm going to ask our worship team to come up and prepare for us a song that we can share together. You know, this is kind of a time. Used to it was an invitation hymn, that was decision song, and then it's, whatever. Bottom line is this: because of the nature of this sermon today, I want you, as we sing, to answer the question in your head, what will I do with Jesus? And if you have not followed him until this day, I want to invite you to step in front of this congregation and surrender to him. Maybe you have followed him for some time, and you just desire to grow more. I want to invite you to allow us to pray with you and for you. What will you do with Jesus? Would you stand? Would you sing? Would you answer that question?